Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Evie Briggs, recent master's in architecture graduate from Taubman College. As made evident by what we've heard over the last day and a half, within the ubiquity of the digital, the political is pervasive. Nothing and nobody is neutral. We've heard how collectives might provide alternatives within the web's isolating bigness, and how broken machines might be the right technologies for change. But even within these hopeful but critical models, there's like this overwhelming inclination to opt out, to go limp, or to break down in the face of such a totalizing technological force. For me, somewhere in the middle of techno-positivism, pessimism, determinism, cynicism, and confusion is just exhaustion. How does one find the energy to resist apathy when it's the addiction to engagement and the constant awareness that leaves you drained? I'm pleased to introduce you to the next set of speakers who will provide 5 unique insights and perspectives on resistance. From the defiant assertion of queerness on Indian digital dating platforms, to rethinking how we frame theories of resistance and confront digital racism, to algorithmic accidents and unpacking the statistics of algorithms, our next panelists pinpoint a diverse range of tactics and insights on resistance. They are, and presenting in this order, Justin Joque, John Cheney-Lippold, Dia Das, Anna Watkins Fisher, and Lisa Nakamura. Justin Joque is the visualization librarian at the University of Michigan Library, where he assists users in finding, manipulating, and analyzing and visualizing diverse types of data. He's the author of Deconstruction Machines, Writing in the Age of Cyber War, a detailed investigation of what happens at the crisis points when cybersecurity systems break down and reveal their internal contradictions. Justin received his BA in history and master's in information science both from the University of Michigan and his PhD in communications from the European Graduate School. John Cheney-Lippold is Associate Professor of American Culture at the University of Michigan. He teaches and writes on the relationship between digital media, identity, and the concept of privacy. He's the author of We Are Data, Algorithms and the Making of Digital Selves, which looks at what identity means in an algorithmic age, how it works, how our lives are controlled by it, and how we can resist it. John received his PhD from USC. Vishnupriya, or Dia Das, is a PhD student at the University of Michigan. She's in the Department of Communication Studies. She's interested in the interaction between technology use and identity formation among migrant communities, and the gender nature of media production and consumption. As part of her master's thesis, she examined the relationship between gender, mobile phones, and development initiatives in India. Dia received both her bachelor's degree in human sciences and master's degree in contemporary India at Oxford University. Anna Watkins Fisher is an assistant professor in the Department of American Culture and the Digital Studies Institute at the University of Michigan. Her research and teaching span digital studies, visual culture, performance studies, and critical theory. Her forthcoming book, The Play and the System, Parasitism and the Art of Resistance from Within, introduces parasitism as a compromised paradigm of resistance in 21st century art and politics. Anna holds her BA from Duke, a master's in performance studies from NYU, and a PhD in modern culture and media from Brown. And lastly, we have Lisa Nakamura, who is the Gwendolyn Calvert Baker Collegiate Professor and the Director of the Digital Studies Institute. She's the leading scholar in the examination of race and digital media, and personally, she's been a formative voice in my understanding and fascination with digital media theory, practice, and reality. Her books include Race After the Internet, Digitizing Race, Visual Cultures of the Internet, Cybertypes, Race, Ethnicity, and Identity on the Internet, and Race in Cyberspace. Lisa received her BA from Reed College and her PhD in English from the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. Please welcome Justin to the lectern.
Great, thank you, and thank you to the organizers for including me. Sorry, let me just pull up my slides really quickly. Sorry, that was the wrong thing. As more and more daily activities are mediated through algorithms, from search results to predictive policing to online dating to shortlisting candidates for jobs to approving lines of credits to making sentencing decisions, it is becoming increasingly clear that these systems produce biased results, recommending longer prison sentences for people of color, disadvantaging women in the workplace, creating new means of redlining, targeting policing towards minority communities, etc., etc. Digital life is becoming more and more automatic and in ways that continually represent sexual, racial, xenophobic, ableist, and other biases. Well, much has been written on the topic, and many of those who are doing this amazing work are in this room here today. One element of this constellation that I've become especially interested in is the role and understanding of probability as it sort of underwrites these systems. Much of what we experience as machine learning, artificial intelligence, and algorithmic decision-making is based on a 20th century turn from symbolic logics to statistical modeling. I have and am writing elsewhere about the centrality of probability to these systems and modern science writ large, so I won't belabor the point here, but I will quote Theodore Dreyer, who in writing about probability states, quote, "The interwar turn towards uncertainty management reverberated throughout science, industry, and government. It was a movement that produced powerful and long-lasting social infrastructures. We are currently experiencing this movement in a revival under its big data iteration, algorithmic uncertainty," end quote. It would not be an understatement to say that today, at least in the digital world, it is through the effects of probability that much of humanity knows and is known. Probability both filters and modulates the information that define a life today and provides a framework through which life and bodies are controlled, diverted, and differentiated. But as soon as we start to place these socio-political developments in the context of probability, a central problem quickly arises. While statisticians, researchers, and mathematicians are adept at the mathematics of probability, no one really knows what probability actually is. Outside of the mysteries of quantum mechanics, events are not probabilistic. It rains tomorrow or it does not. A theory is true or it is not. A coin lands heads or tails. It does not land 50% tails. Thus, in the words of Leonard Savage, an influential 20th century Bayesian statistician, quote, "As to what probability is and how it is connected with statistics, there's seldom been such complete disagreement and breakdown of communication since the Tower of Babel," end quote. In that light, I would like to offer an all too brief and broad overview of two answers to this metaphysical question of what probability is, and to suggest that both of them contain within them certain political tendencies or at least presuppositions. And the latter of these answers, namely Bayesian inference, shapes much of the landscape of digital and algorithmic politics that we confront today. The first of these approaches can most clearly be associated with the name of Ronald Fisher. While employed as an agricultural researcher at the Rothamsted Experimental Station in eastern England during the interwar period, Fisher developed a system of experimental design upon which modern hypothesis testing is based, developing what we now know as frequentism, the type of statistics that is most often taught in introductory statistics classes. Frequentism imagines probability, then, as an objective fact defined as the long-run frequency of some event, such as the number of heads in multiple coin flips. With this objective definition of probability, Fisher aimed to solve one of the central challenges of a significant portion of modern scientific research. How does one determine if observed results are due to experimental conditions or chance alone? To put it all too briefly, Fisher's answer is that a researcher should set up an experiment to evaluate if two populations differ in some measurable aspect. So for example, one might compare a new fertilizer with a currently used fertilizer. Somewhat counterintuitively, one then asks the question, if there is in fact no difference between these two treatments, the old and the new fertilizer, what are the odds of observing the results that I saw by random chance alone? Then this probability is what we know as the p-value. In Fisher's design of experiments, one simply gathers evidence against the possibility that chance alone accounts for what was observed. One element of this is especially important to note for our purposes. In a proper Fisherian understanding of frequentist experimental design, one cannot assign a probability to a hypothesis or a single event. Either it is true or not. The result of the test can inform what we believe, but it is not the probability of the hypothesis itself which is returned. On a broader level, and in philosophical terms, Fisher's theory of statistical induction is a theory of difference. The base question that undergirds statistical work is whether or not two groups are different. We might trace this fundamental concern with difference back to Fisher's early agricultural work, where he labored over determining the difference between various cultivation methods. The primary role of science in such a framework is not to understand causal mechanisms, but rather to ascertain when two groups are different. For Fisher, the universal law that can be derived from data is the existence of group-level difference. We might then recall here what Dr. Sharma told us yesterday of how tech bros and white supremacists are invested in theories of binary sexual and racial difference. And in this vein, we can begin to see, to put it in the careful languages of statistics, a correlation, if not causation, between much of this early statistical work and proponents of eugenics, a science of racialized difference, such as the work of Francis Galton, Carl Pearson, and Ronald Fisher himself. Fisher's first academic appointment was in the eugenics department at the University College London, and he published at length about population eugenics. After World War II, when many scientists turned away from eugenics, he maintained his commitment, even vocally objecting to a UNESCO statement signed by a handful of prominent scientists, declaring theories of racial difference scientifically and morally indefensible. In the final analysis, his ideology and conception of scientific method were dedicated to the detection and explication of group-level difference. He was quite literally a man who believed in the truth of blood and soil, an agriculturalist and a scientific racist. So beyond the political critique of this model of statistical inference, we may advance. In practice, this model is also one in deep crisis. One has only to look to all the replication crises affecting the sciences, especially experimental psychology. The combination of this crisis with the growing ease with which large real-time data streams can be processed has created the conditions for the Bayesian revolution in statistics. Well, the history of Bayesian analysis dates back to the 18th century work of the eponymous Reverend Thomas Bayes and later Pierre-Simon Laplace. As a modern phenomena, Bayesian analysis has only really come into its own in the last 30 or 40 years, corresponding with the development of modern computing. For this type of analysis is computationally intensive. A number of key philosophical differences between Bayesian statistics and Fisher's frequentism are notable and helpful for articulating the ways in which the shift in understanding probability has shaped the politics of digital life. First, rather than seeing probability as an objective long-run frequency of some system, here probability measures subjective belief in something, for example, whether it will rain. In this way, it shares some noteworthy intellectual commitments with certain strains of standpoint theory. Second, rather than centering finite experiments that are designed to tell us some enduring truth, Bayesian statistics provides a framework to constantly update our beliefs as new data arrives. Third, in contradistinction to frequentism, probabilities can be directly assigned to hypotheses and single events. Thus, we see those heart attack-inducing election night tickers showing us the probability of one candidate winning or losing. Finally, where frequentism grounded the basic mathematics of probability in its long-run, really existing frequency, one of the most compelling justifications for subjective Bayesian statistics is known as the Dutch book argument, which derives the basic laws of probability from the imagined exchange of betting contracts. In short, it grounds probability in a theory of markets and information-based exchanges. These shifts then align with, and I would even argue allow for, the rise of algorithmic systems that we see today. Instead of using data to understand group-level difference, the ability to assign a probability to individual events and hypotheses means that each visitor to a website, each convict, each applicant for a job or credits actions can be assigned a probability, and then the most probable outcome can be selected. Analysis ceases to worry about whether a certain population segment or group will pay back a loan, and instead asks whether a specific individual will. Despite Bayesian statistics being subjective, the ability to assign a probability to a hypothesis allows this subjectivity to be automated, as algorithms can create a vast field of hypotheses from which the most likely outcome can be selected. Thus, if Fisher was an agriculturalist, this modern Bayesian interpretation of probability is directly apiece with a neoliberal digital and informational world. And while this move to individual prediction may sound positive, in practice, many of these systems continue to reproduce racial, sexual, ableist, etc. bias. This is clear from recent work such as Sophia Noble's, Kathy O'Neill's, Virginia Eubanks, or the recent ProPublica research on racial bias in the COMPAS algorithm for predicting the likelihood of recidivism. Wendy Chun's recent work on homophily, Love of the Same, provides a helpful explication of this phenomena. She argues that the principle of homophily, as it's used in digital systems, pushes people towards those who are the same, creating digital spaces that are segregated along the multiple and intersecting vectors of our social existence. And while Chun shows this homophilic principle at work in network analysis, we can see it in work with probability as well, as so many algorithms function by finding the most probable neighbor to interpolate a decision from. Thus, according to Chun, these algorithms essentially function by laundering extant bias. Moreover, they erase the history, economics, and politics of racialized capitalism and patriarchy and present them as accidental, ultimately creating the very segregated space that we see now giving return to white supremacist and patriarchal theories of biology. Thus, to put this in terms of probability, the mobile, momentary, individual correlations that Bayesian analysis seeks end up erasing longer histories, and then through the production of digital homophily, creating the space for the reproduction of the very claims of outmoded universal biological difference that Fisher once peddled. I fear that this has all been too quick and perhaps too dark and painted with too broad of brushstrokes. Still, I hope to at least have suggested the ways in which the metaphysics of probability and the politics of statistics dictate the ways in which knowledge is produced and valued, shaping many of the issues that we confront in living in a digital, or I think we might even now say, a Bayesian age. Well, clearly this story is a negative one. If there's any glimmer of hope or grounds for resistance, it can be found in the fact that the understanding of statistics and probability are shifting, open, currently in crisis, and thus ripe for humanistic and critical intervention. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Cheney-Lippold. As stated, I'm Associate Professor of Digital American Culture, as well as a participant within the Digital Studies Initiative, Institute, whatever you want to call it. I'm very interested in the digital, and I don't have a title for my talk. So let's just think about it as a hodgepodge, and what I'm going to say next. It's a lot of it is stuff maybe you've heard before if you've heard me talk. It's stuff that I've been grappling with for the past several, 5, 6, 7 years. But it's also stuff that I felt might be comparable to think through along these different lines of scholarship about how maybe the digital provides not a new necessarily, but a distinct way of understanding politics and thus understanding difference. Go back to the second slide first, after this. This is a quotation by Melvin Kranzberg. It's a very famous quotation. It's the first law of technology. I use this precisely because Sophia Bruckner took my other one, which was Donna Haraway, talking about how technology is not neutral. I want to think about this not just in terms of it's neither good nor bad nor neutral. I just want to think that technology has no common vocabulary. There's no common vocabulary that we can use to talk about Instagram or Snap or whatever, but also there's no common vocabulary we can necessarily use to talk about the digital and the non-digital. So I want to think about that in terms of empowerment and redefinition. I think that power does something to technology that is very constitutive. It, one, reproduces biases, as has been explained by several scholars already mentioned, but it also does the things of, again, what Chen says, laundering asymmetries into its final product, but evacuating the histories of the asymmetries so they just come out as a clean output. This is a very, very, very famous, and for me, my favorite example of digital culture that I show to every class I have, video called HP Computers Are Racist. It's a 2009 video that has Wanda Zeman on the left, who uploaded the video on YouTube, and Desi Cryer on the right. They're two employees at an unnamed Texas retail store, and they're using an HP Media Smart computer. That computer had state-of-the-art, big quotations around that, facial recognition software that was, maybe see where it's coming from, it identified Wanda Zeman perfectly. When Desi Cryer's face came into frame, it completely stopped. All of the zooming that was happening, stopped, and it became then just a normal camera, no facial recognition, nothing. And he said, I put it here, HP computers are racist. And it is true. It's completely true. The problem is probably the training data that was used as the algorithmic assessments that were based in often white gazes. It's the engineers in Silicon Valley who are completely misrepresentative of the actual population. So digital technology, in the ways that especially algorithms produce knowledge, launder these biases in so that it reproduces the stuff that we've heard for centuries about post-colonialism, Frantz Fanon, Simone Brown, Sylvia Wynter. People talking about how the human is not a neutral, common thing. It has layers that precede it and layers that follow it. In my interest, I'm also thinking about how algorithms redefine things, how algorithms redefine identity, reproduce and redefine. In this case, you see still from face.com. It's a 2010 still from a company that has since been bought by Facebook for several tens of millions of dollars, that not just says if or if not, our friend Dawson here has a face, which is 78% true, but what his gender is, glasses, lips, mood, smiling, even in the gray, you can see his estimated age and also the max and minimum. And the important thing is that these are not true. These are, as almost expressed by Justin too, like the idea of a statistical probability. Probability can be 100% or 0%. It's always going to be in the middle. It's always going to be something that a percentage buffet by which some person is going to have to decide, this is enough, this is the threshold by which we're going to say, yes, that is a sufficient thing to call this person a face, or to say that this person is smiling or is happy, which obviously he's not. We can extend this mode of analysis to companies like Quantcast. It's an analytic company from San Francisco that assesses users' gender and college education level based on things like websites visited, device used, apps used. So this is useful as an exemplar because not only does it show the kind of hollowness and the evacuation of these histories, but it also at the bottom it says actual models include hundreds of factors. There's something very productive in thinking about these algorithmic identifications because you were never just a college graduate. If you start to go to a bunch of lowbrow sites, I've been big air quotations, you might actually lose your college degree in this algorithmic form. You can change your gender, you can change your education accordingly. In this case, also we see the audience breakdowns that Quantcast gives sites that allows people to produce content based on these assumptions of who the audience base is. So here we see not only gender, but we see age, we see political affiliation, we see, again, college, we see how much money somebody's making. The idea being if people come to a site who are really, really rich, it might not be that they're actually rich, or they just seem rich. There's this kind of asymmetry of how we understand it, and thus a misrepresentation if we try to use old vocabulary to talk about these new phenomena. This is best expressed in a 2016, they called it a feature, but obviously it's a bug, ethnic affinity Facebook profiling opportunity where it allowed people to use the Facebook platform to advertise or to give people personalized content based on their assumed ethnicity. There's two important things to note here, one of which is the glaring omission of any whiteness whatsoever, which obviously assumes some sort of default status for the white body. But two, what it does is it uses this interesting vocabulary, ethnic affinity. It's not ethnicity, it's affinity for one's ethnicity, or for an ethnicity. At the end of the day, though, what it is an assemblage of different things that you liked on your Facebook page. It's not necessarily shared heritage, a sense of belonging, or the things that have historically understood ethnicity as a productive and important point of resistance. Facebook also does this with class. This is a patent that Facebook put to determine, quote, what is the probability that a user is in the middle class? And it begins with an interestingly vulgar intersectional analysis. It doesn't take class as a beginning. What it does is it takes age as a beginning, routes it through either devices or home ownership, and then eventually to education or where that home is owned. More simply, the actual amount of devices you have produces your class, and so paradoxically, you spend more money on devices, you actually become more and more wealthy. All of these embody the conceptual move that C. Edwin Baker calls corrupt segmentation, and I want to do a shout out to Christian Sandvik, who I don't think is here today, who gave me this topic and gave me this idea based on a blog post he has on corrupt personalization. I think it was 2013, a very useful post. But nonetheless, Baker's talking about how segmentation is always going to be developed according to something often beyond the values or needs of the group that's being segmented. In this case, it's the steering mechanisms of bureaucratic power or money. In this case then, when we're talking about something and when power's talking about something, if we could differentiate those for the moment, we might not be talking about the same thing. We actually might be talking about something that's extraordinarily different. This is much more understandable if we look at the existence of the NSA's algorithm for citizenship, which we found out in the 2013 Snowden documents, especially in the PRISM documents, that detailed on the top, if you can read this, that in the huge assemblage of surveillance that the NSA was conducting, they had no ability to determine who was a citizen and who was a foreigner. Under the ostensible auspices of the Constitution, U.S. persons, not necessarily citizens, but U.S. persons deserve the right to privacy, and any surveillance requires some sort of legal precedent or legal warrant. And the case is, well, how do we attend to a fact that the surveillance of the PRISM program, for example, surveils everybody? It has everybody that's in their mall. There's no way for you to understand, if you're an analyst of the NSA, if a person's a citizen or foreigner. We don't surf with their passports or birth certificates attached to our monitor or implicit in our Facebook profiles. So the way they did that is actually quite interesting. In 2009, there's an Eric Holder signed document that actually shows how the definitions of foreignness are allocated within the NSA worldview. The first one we're going to look at is if your IP address is existing outside of the boundaries of the United States. So if you go on a vacation, for example, you're becoming more foreigner. If you use encryption or steganography, you also become more foreign. Essentially things that have nothing to do with citizenship at the end of the day. Also, if you are talking to somebody who is also reasonably believed to be a foreigner, which is interesting because it's not, you are a foreigner, but somebody who's 51% reasonably believed to be a foreigner. If you have somebody on your buddy list, again, this is 2009, we can assume this is Twitter followers or this is Facebook friends, you are becoming more and more foreign. And most damningly, in 2008, O Globo, a Brazilian newspaper, found out that if you speak anything other than English, you become more and more foreign. So it produces this, going back to the HP Computers as racist example, this horribly exemplar notion of what is the ideal citizen. It is a person who stays within the boundaries of the United States, never encrypts their communication, never talks to anybody who could even perceive to be a foreigner, and only talks in English. Well, who's the obverse? Maybe who is a citizen but might be interpreted as otherwise. Potentially a diasporic community, potentially a Central American who lives in Nevada, who communicates and travels with their family in Nicaragua, speaks Spanish, encrypts their communication because both states are untrustworthy, determining nonetheless the idea that they might be a U.S. person, U.S. citizen in heart, but algorithmically, according to these corrupt interpretations, they become foreigner nonetheless. This is very well done in an artistic formation. If you follow the work of James Bridle, who worked a little bit with me to determine this, to make this browser plugin that actually calculates your algorithmic citizenship based on the websites you visit. Again, it's an artistic rendering, so it's not at all about how the NSA does it, but it's suggestive to the fact that as we produce data, we're producing not only information that becomes aggregated into some sort of data valence system, but it is nonetheless used to produce new knowledges, ideas of who we are that are 100% potentially different from who we are and who we want to be. Which leads us to eventually how I'm trying to think about politics as I move forward with my research, which is using the work of the accident. This is conversations that I've had with Justin Joque about this for years, thinking about what are the new ways we can understand algorithms as proceeding in the future. And I'm taking this quotation from Catherine Malibu to think through what is the difference with the algorithm, how can we understand it as producing knowledge that might be accidental in a way that's productively useful, outside of the common vocabulary that when we talk of citizenship, in the offline world, we're talking about citizenship in the online. We're talking about gender in the offline world. We're talking about gender in the online. I'm going to argue, and I'm thinking about this more and more as I especially consider I'm researching autonomous cars and especially the Tesla algorithm for automatic driving, how it is that a car, when it's trying to assess what's in front of it, it's not going to understand it on the level that we understand it. It's going to understand the level of hues and patterns and the deep learning that has understood what an object is or what a stop sign is, for example. I had a couple of videos I wanted to show, but for the sake of time, I think I'm going to end it there. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the presentations. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm going to start off by talking about the big question guiding my research, which is what does intimacy mean in a world where our interactions with each other are increasingly being mediated by a variety of digital platforms, more specifically smartphone apps for me. The way I chip away at this really big question is through ethnographic work within the dating app production space in India. So over the last 3 years, I've spent about 10 months conducting field work between Delhi, India's capital, and Bangalore, which is the equivalent of Silicon Valley in India. And what I want to do in my time today is go through some preliminary thoughts I have from one part of this larger project, and this part looks at how notions of queerness and Indianness are mobilized by dating app companies targeting the LGBTQ community in the country. So 2018 was a big year for both smartphones and dating apps in India. So during the year, India overtook the US to become the second largest smartphone market in the world after China. And global dating app leader Tinder announced that just 2 years after setting up their first headquarter outside the US ever in India, they had managed to supplant Netflix to become the top grossing non-game-based Android app in the country. But for me and a lot of people that I was talking to, 2018 was memorable for a very different reason. It was memorable because after over 2 decades of a long series of legal battles in the court system, homosexuality was finally decriminalized by the Supreme Court. And this happened on September 6th, and on September 7th, the very next day, newspapers were filled with coverage about what this meant for the future of both India as well as the LGBTQ community more broadly. One of my favorite covers from the spew of media and writing and memes all circulating at this time is this one by the Times of India. You can't quite read it over here, but you can see the big sign that says Independence Day #2. And right above that, in small letters, is this ode to freedom that talks about how this judgment is a beginning of a new freedom song for the queer community in the country. So it talks about how this judgment is going to bring with it a freedom to love anyone, a freedom from fear of persecution, a freedom to just be oneself. And while these grand claims, I think, should be taken with a big spoonful of salt, if believed at all, I think they're nonetheless really important because they capture the sense of excitement and possibility and hope circulating in urban middle class centers in India, particularly among young people. But the real reason why I love this particular cover is because right above this ode to freedom at the very top is a banner advertising a new fingerprint recognition smartphone about to be launched by leading Chinese manufacturer Vivo. And this juxtaposition of these two things, this juxtaposition of freedom and digital fingerprint recognition, captures this, I guess now, mundane idea that freedom to be oneself is increasingly being premised as something that can only be accessible through a specific narrow mode of self-disclosure and categorization that digital platforms like dating apps provide. So, coming back to the dating app ecosystem in India, I'm interested in the ways in which self-disclosure and self-categorization, which are features of the programming and business logics of most of these dating app platforms, rub up against their claims of these platforms providing a new emancipatory space for young people, particularly women and queer folk in India, to exercise their choice and express their desires. For example, in the months following the legalization of homosexuality, organizations in the country's dating app ecosystem, some of these logos that you can see over here that have got a little bit messed up, all released statements and ads and even deployed new UX features for the Indian market that supported this change. For example, Tinder rolled out 23 gender identity options for its users, and Chinese-based gay dating app Blue D hired a new local CSR manager specifically to expand operations in the region and tie up with other businesses. Among these players, I want to draw your attention to a new dating app company called Delta, not the airline, completely different, that began to take off during this time. So Delta is an India-specific dating app aimed at the queer community. It's the one at the corner left over there with the rainbow colors. And there are two things that are particularly striking about Delta. One is that it advertises itself repeatedly as a homegrown app. And two is that it targets the LGBTQIA plus community rather than just heterosexual users or homosexual users like most dating platforms tend to do. So the questions I had as I spent time in their offices were things like, one, how does nationality and regional identity manifest itself in the construction of their interface? And what are some of the difficulties that come up with trying to design an app that embraces this breadth of identities that's encompassed in the term LGBTQIA+, while still doing the job that it is supposed to do, which is matching people? So I was sitting in their South Delhi office talking to one of their early funders and advisors of the company, trying to get them to actually open up and answer questions. And he went on to say, Dia, stop. It's all in the name Delta. He explained that the name Delta was a very conscious and thoughtful decision that they made while starting this company. It was a play on the symbol lambda, which was used by the Gay Activist Alliance in New York in the 1970s to signify LGBTQ inclusion. He explained, and I know no chemistry here, so I'm going to do my best, that in chemistry, lambda and delta are used to signify optical isomers, which means that these symbols are used to refer to two molecules that have the same formula, but because of a different arrangement of atoms, they have different properties. And so he kept on emphasizing how lambda as a symbol would never be enough to capture the queer experience of India, because sociocultural norms, economic conditions, and histories of colonization made the risk of being queer in India fundamentally different from spaces where a lot of these apps are being produced. And this difference, he argued, demands a different digital structure. It demands a different kind of app. So, for example, one way this difference manifests is access to more safety in physical space becomes part of what is being provided in the app. So when you sign on to Delta, you're immediately introduced to a list of inclusive safe spaces for the LGBTQ community. Things like coffee shops, club nights, hotels, bars. And you can filter these based on where you're geographically located, which city you're from. What's interesting for me is not whether these features are effective or good or even necessarily inclusive, because the short answer is that they're not. They're extremely privileged spaces in this list. They're all five-star hotels or the insides of embassies. But yeah, they're good cafes and embassies, apparently. But instead, what I want to get at by looking at this kind of design decision is what app production might tell us about different ways of thinking about our relationship with space. So what strikes me here is that rather than thinking about digital and physical as these two distinct oppositional forces, or for that matter, thinking about digitality and physicality as being completely meaningless and the world now is this happy hybrid space because we're continuously shifting between these two modes, these two spaces in our everyday interaction with different platforms, I think it's still worthwhile of thinking about access to physical spaces through digital platforms as really important. So Delta here isn't just simply an app where people find each other and transition then to meet up in a physical space, or even transition to other digital platforms like SMS or WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger, but rather digital features of searchability and geolocation are consciously used to access safe spaces that allow people to express their desires. And most importantly, that all of this becomes what a queer app is supposed to do. However, it's not all good. Trying to ensure safety by verifying users as authentic, as truly members of the LGBTQIA+ community, while remaining open and diverse and non-judgmental about how people might choose to express their sexual orientation, leads to several different problems in designing an inclusive space. Rather than me listing it out, I want to tell you what an Android developer at the company neatly put all of this together in one rant. And so I want to tell you what he said to me, which was, we have more genders and more matching, and everybody has to have the right match. And some people don't know what terms mean, so they just click on things. And there have to be more users also, because otherwise there'll just be two people with the same sexual preference. But we can't let everybody in because we also need verification. And then there is a social taboo, because being gay is still a big thing. So it is difficult. And that's sort of where I ended up at. It is difficult. It's difficult to design for messy desires. We often don't know exactly who we are or what we want while trying to find a connection. But programmability and design logics continually tend to require us to filter ourselves into these categories and to categorize ourselves in ways that are often directly oppositional to this messy breadth of how we feel and how we long to connect with each other. I'm still trying to work out what this means and how to frame this more theoretically and coherently, but I know where I want to start. And that is by more consciously resisting the kind of academic language of complexity and nuance, and more actively embracing this notion of mess while writing about the intersection of digital technologies in urban India. Thank you.
So thank you all for being here. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to EBI for moderating. And thank you to my fellow co-panelists. I realized that I actually was very attracted to this light blue. The AI color that we learned earlier is associated with being cold and lonely. So the title of my talk today is Remind Me Tomorrow, Resistance in the Age of Inevitability. Is resistance still possible in the digital era? Digital technologies have long been hailed for their revolutionary promise as platforms that enable collaboration and access to information and liberate users from real-world divisions and institutionalized inequalities. But despite the persistence of this utopian narrative in Silicon Valley and beyond, to live in the digital moment means to experience firsthand how digital platforms, despite their many affordances, have not made for a more open and accessible world for all, but have contributed to the extreme consolidation of power and rendered even more insecure conditions for those at the bottom of capitalism's hierarchies. And just a quick plug for Precarity Lab, a research collective I'm part of, with a number of people in the room, including Lisa here at U of M, and we're focused on exploring these questions. Digital technologies, while sold as tools of individual empowerment, have thus overwhelmingly contributed to a sense of collective disempowerment. While this feeling is widely acknowledged and commonly invoked, discussions of it tend to repeat and amplify a pattern of frustration and powerlessness. My talk today will attempt to unpack some of the assumptions we make when we talk about resistance and how those have been undermined by digital technologies to suggest some new points of entry for conceptualizing resistance today. And I'm really going to be focusing on individual agency, individual kinds of resistance, not so much collective organizing. Media theory after Deleuze has emphasized the totalizing reach of power as it has become ever more diffuse, discrete, and participatory. Such critical accounts have found precious little possibility for resistance. While they have convincingly established the imminent and increasingly automatic nature of domination under neoliberal, networked, and platform capitalism, they have risked overstating the system's closure to meaningful action and foreclosing as hopeless the very possibility of resistance they presumably value and desire. The paradox of resistance in the digital age might thus be glossed. If it's possible or sustainable, then it's probably not resistance. Resistance, as it has been traditionally defined within the disciplines of cultural studies, anthropology, and sociology, typically describes an individual or group that is consciously countering, disrupting, rejecting, subverting, or refusing some dominant mode of power or institutional or social norms. As such, it's generally presumed several things. It's generally presumed a volitional subject or agent. a clearly identifiable opponent or problematic, and the possibility of assuming an oppositional stance. So in the remainder of my talk, I want to turn to a series of what I think are emblematic examples that gesture toward how complex digital systems have eroded each of these traditional handholds of resistance, leaving in their wake a sense of inevitability and powerlessness. Each example explores a different way that resistance is neutralized, absorbed, weakened, redirected, and any possible negative user response is reframed as a positive outcome. So acquiescence to options given, continued participation on the platform. And what interests me in particular about these examples is how they reveal a disturbing disjuncture between complex systems and individuals' ability to resist. So this is not just a disjuncture of scale, but it's importantly for me a disjuncture of temporality. I'm really interested in temporality in these different examples. So obstacle 1, a volitional subject or agent. The legal, ethical, and political frameworks that govern us are based on the idea of the autonomous individual. However, the notion of the liberal subject imbued with the capacity to consent fails to square with digital structures of power, as we can see from something as simple as software agreements, software agreement contracts. I think this speaks to some of the things that Meg was talking about this morning. If the contract has been conceived as the bedrock of Western liberal democracy, what choice do we have when operating systems won't take no for an answer, presenting, as Apple OS does, a false plurality of choice? So we have try in an hour, try tonight, or remind me tomorrow. Either our devices eventually stop working because we don't update, or they stop working because we do. With only a pre-programmed menu of options to choose from, the user's only recourse is to defer a choice that has already been made. And we see this notion in something like this chase pop-up, right? Where we have accept, but we have no decline button. We find this same logic in the default acceptance of terms used in what are called click and accept software agreements, what are also called shrink wrap agreements. And here's an example, referring to software licensing contracts that can only be read and accepted after the consumer has already opened the product, right? Thus activating the contract. So as these agreements suggest, our relationships with state and corporate platforms is increasingly determined in advance by preemptive contracts that offload legal and ethical responsibility onto individual users, consumers, and citizens. Okay, so obstacle 2. A clearly identifiable opponent or problematic. Today, disruption and critique are not what threaten powerful entities' stability, but are essential to their functioning. Increasingly, radical actors find themselves implicated in and dependent on, indeed employed by, precariously employed by often, the very power structures they would otherwise oppose. By making potentially radical actors complicit with them, powerful corporations and institutions effectively invite forms of identification that blur the line between the dominant and the dominated, that make it difficult to think of an us versus them, right? To think of a strategic opponent. So let's consider an example of this. The practice of hiring what are called bug hunters to locate vulnerabilities in corporate and government software and web applications has become more and more prevalent since the 1990s. The practice is part of a wider trend toward crowdsourcing corporate problem solving in the gig economy. So Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Samsung, Uber, Tesla, and Apple, these all have cash for bug schemes. Even the US government has gotten in on the action with their Hack the Pentagon program. This is a Department of Defense pilot program that invites what they call responsible hackers, which I think is very interesting. Responsible hackers required to register and submit to a background check, so to submit to future surveillance certainly, to locate vulnerabilities in cyber security systems. So we also find, I think, a very similar logic in other places, right? When modes of anti-establishment art and critique are embraced by universities, museums, and the like as profitable marketing strategies. Such institutions have adopted critical discourses of disobedience and dissent without carrying over the politics of these into their business models. In early 2017, as many of you may know, MIT Media Lab announced that it would offer a $250,000 award for what they called responsible ethical disobedience. And this award was bankrolled by LinkedIn. Quote, "You don't change the world by doing what you're told," end quote, MIT Media Lab director Joque said, with a remarkable absence of irony in his announcement of the award. You don't change the world by doing what you're told. This irony, that irony of demanding that one refuse to follow the rules, demanding they refuse to follow the rules, is echoed in this graphic that appeared on MIT's website advertising the award, which depicts the figure of disobedience as one of mass production and standardization. So the critical point here for me is absolutely not the worthiness of the awarded projects. Flint Water has been awarded, Me Too, but how this reward domesticates, how it co-opts and tames disobedience, enacting a move that Isabel Grau has characterized as subversion for hire. The absorption of resistance in these examples is not only strategic and rhetorical, but crucially for my argument, infrastructural. They show how criticism and activism are increasingly appropriated and reframed as useful feedback for improving neoliberal information systems and technologies, as useful feedback. Such examples compel us to ask, what is the efficacy of resistance when it performs an immunitary function that renders the structures it seeks to challenge all the more impervious to it? This is not just about tokenized subversives, but it's about a strategy by which corporations and institutions reframe structural problems as feedback that has already been integrated. They never fail because they are only in the process of getting better. By presenting themselves as a work in process, presenting failure as market research for future success, they can never be found at fault. Okay, so obstacle 3, the possibility of assuming an oppositional stance. Now let's turn from the absorption of resistance to when the act of resistance in one moment can be used as a tool of repression in the next. The disruptive potential of social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, widely hyped in the wake of the Arab Spring and Occupy movements for their effectiveness in organizing and raising awareness and scaling up mass protests, has increasingly been appropriated as an apparatus for honing practices of social control. So in 2008, many of you may know this, the U.S. Department of Defense launched, they've been very busy, launched the Minerva Research Initiative, a program that funds university research projects in line with DoD priorities. Among the awardees was a 2014 Cornell project that analyzed the digital traces, what they call the digital traces, so Twitter posts and conversations of popular uprisings, among them the Egyptian Revolution. And they did this to develop capture models for anticipating what they called the tipping point of social movement mobilizations, the moment when it became mainstream, the moment when it became a mass movement. In 2016, the ACLU reported on a similar use of social media. The social media company Geophedia, which is a tech firm that's bankrolled by In-Q-Tel, the CIA's venture capital firm, was applying user data from Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to create real-time maps that police use to monitor, identify, and arrest Black Lives Matter protesters. The Cornell Project and Geophedia both highlight the directly contradictory political ends to which social media platforms are being utilized. They show, and so there's a direct contradiction, but there's also a temporality. They show how the use of social networks for radical activism maps in the very act of resistance its potential co-option just thereafter. Such capture models weaponize protest energies. They make social movements mappable and predictable and therefore preventable before they can even get off the ground. And in so doing, they undermine, at least in their domestic applications, U.S. citizens' constitutionally protected right to assemble and protest. So just to start to kind of wrap up, a culture of pervasive automation and predictive analytics dispossesses citizens and users of their ability to act in the present, replacing real-time actions with a constrained set of pre-programmed responses and using activist movements to make predictive models that limit their ability to act in the future. In such a moment, when subsumption is synonymous with defeat, we must step back from despair and make peace with operating from a compromised position. Rather than abandon resistance or mourn its failure as inevitable, in closing, I want to gesture very briefly toward what I think are some tenets that we need to think about for a theory of resistance, things that a theory of resistance needs to account for. So I think it needs to account for not a volitional subject, but a quasi-subject. And I think John's work really speaks to this. Not a volitional full subject, but a quasi-subject that's networked and that's not isolatable. It needs to speak to not a theory, not a clearly identifiable opponent, but it needs we need a tactics and an ethics of complicity, and ethics is very important. And finally, we need a theory of resistance that's not an oppositional stance, but where practices of resistance can be non-oppositional. In other words, where enmeshment, inevitability, where these cannot be the end of politics, but where they can be understood as grounds for future planning. Thank you.
Here it is. How do I get it to... Where is it? Upper left, this one.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Those were amazing papers. I am so honored to be giving a talk after those. So the talk I'm giving today is the beginnings of a work that I hope will help designers and programmers understand what race is, because I don't think they really know, and not through any fault of their own. So in earlier work, I have spent some time talking about how it is that the digital industries became so racially and so segregated in terms of race and gender, right? I mean, here's something which has so many liberal people within it, yet is incredibly divided along, you know, mostly male, mostly white lines. So I'm interested in the materiality of the digital, and so I'm just going to really quickly plug the Digital Studies Institute, because I think this is where the work of people doing critical making, writing, thinking, hopefully can come together to add something to both fields or both kinds of praxis. So as I said in earlier work, I've looked at the ways that women of color's labor has absolutely underwritten the existence of digital media. That were it not for women making inexpensive electronics, often in immiserated conditions, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be having any of these conversations. And so that's absolutely necessary, to have cheap labor that continually pours itself into making inexpensive products so that we can continue to have 18-month cycles for different things. So in this presentation, I'm asking, what is race and racism in the digital age? How do we need to understand it as makers and designers? And how is it that people now are interested in this after 20 years of denying the existence of racism in the internet? So it seems that this is the perpetual deferral, the perpetual turn. I think that VR 2.0, which people are actually calling VR 2.0, is a symptom of this. That finally, I think, as you know, if O'Reilly says it, it has to be true, that the party's over, right? The data's day of reckoning is finally over. We can build a future we want to live in, or we can build a nightmare. The choice is up to us. I think the consensus is that it already happened, right? It already is past. It is a nightmare for a lot of people. And as well, TechCrunch, the most optimistic entity, as far as I know, for always growing, always incubating, always innovating, has also said Silicon Valley is over, in the sense that it finally needs to reckon with the things that it's done about ignoring the truth, ignoring people, not okay Google. So if even TechCrunch says they don't believe you when you say don't be evil, then no one believes you, right? So 2018, they locate this as the year. And, I think this is a consensus because the idea is that we no longer believe that tech companies are the good guys, right? This may be their intention, but that's not what's actually happening. So again, this happened. What's kind of sad about it is that no one thinks it's going to make any difference. It's not really a big enough fine to change any of the ways that Facebook works. People have mentioned before breaking up Facebook. Chris Hughes calling for that. It's not going to probably happen, but this is in the air anyway. So there is a need now in the industry to try and fix its problems. So again, the labor of people of color is going to be invoked here to try and address this issue. And I want to speak to two things that everybody thinks designers and programmers particularly need to have. So I was following this interesting Twitter. What do you think programmers need to know? And this was from the point of view of a professor. What should I teach them? And two answers came up over and over again. The first one was empathy, which I'm going to be talking about. And the second one was ethics. And these are articulated to specific platforms. So when people talk about ethics, what they're talking about is AI. There are a lot of institutions, conferences, books, papers, white papers about ethics and AI. Those two things kind of go together like peanut butter and jelly, right? The idea is that ethics is a neutral, analytical, empirical way of understanding what should be done, and that AI is similar in the sense that it works along these lines. It's apolitical. It's not about resistance. It's about clarity. But empathy is articulated very much to virtual reality because it's supposed to be a technology of feeling. So the labor of feeling, often called emotional labor, is already borne disproportionately by people of color and women of color, particularly in the tech industries, who often are there to bear the burden of diversity, right? So when Mark Zuckerberg says one of the most powerful features of VR is empathy, the industry's turned a little bit. Partly because Zuckerberg appeared in a VR event where he was in Puerto Rico high-fiving somebody in his company while people's dead dogs and, houses were being flooded. So I don't know if you saw this one. I didn't want to show it again because I don't like to give it too much airspace. And people said, how could you possibly do that, Mark Zuckerberg? That is the most callous thing I've ever seen in my life, right? So he's a person who needs empathy, I think, and has also decided to purchase Oculus, which is a VR company, which markets itself often as an empathy machine. So you can automate empathy now, right? The thing that you need to have, that you cannot somehow generate within yourself, can be produced, which can then make it easy to understand what racism is because you will know when you feel it. So if VR is the emotional medium that users need to feel in order to feel that they know, having content that puts you supposedly in the body of someone who's different can have effects which people see as very, very important. So I'm interested in groups like Pathos Labs, which markets itself around the tears that people sometimes feel when they use VR. And I'm interested in this also as a callback to the 90s. So I'll give you a minute to look at it. So this reminds me of the 90s because it celebrates lack of regulation, the perennial openness, the kind of inability to control or the inability even to give feedback, as Anna was saying, of that time. The idea that there are no rules, yay. So I think it's the yay that really interests me here. It's a kind of return to the idea that we can make things without thinking them through first. That we want to be first to market, we want to be the biggest, we want to own the headset market, and no one knows who's going to own the headset market yet. And that we can do this by making something that the industry and that our society really needs, which is racial empathy. So titles like this really show the emotional tone deafness of what is happening, I think, around VR for empathy. So the circle actually was never made. A lot of this VR stuff is vaporware. If you look at it, it never actually happened. But the idea that you can even think about something like this and get in the paper, I think it was Engadget that did this one, shows the appetite for this solution. There are titles like 6x9 that put the viewer in a death row prisoner cell. We Wait depicts the drowning of a refugee family on the crossing between Greece and Italy as you watch from really close up. I call this Virtuous, virtual reality. It succeeds in creating a sensation in the body that mimics the implied presence and experience of another in favor of actually knowing about another by, say, talking to that person, right? So the way you know it's real is because you feel it for yourself. The experience of VR's racial empathy makes the experience of racism and of race something that's privatized. So as students often say when they're stuck with a dilemma, like what is racism, and they've never been taught to know, the answer is always, it's your own opinion, right? It becomes very private. It's your own experience. It's what you think it is. And that's what VR does, only it tells you by telling you what to feel and when to cry. So look at this a little bit. The same guy is very interested in seeing VR makers not as media makers, but as engineers, specifically engineers of the body. So he says what VR does is it hacks your body into becoming more empathetic. So it's not about persuasion, it's not about representation, it's about going right into the body and making you feel something that you might not want to feel or even know what you're feeling. So he says you may have trouble comprehending it, but you will know when you feel it. Again, kind of seeing the body as something which can rule the mind. And this studio helpfully tells you what pathos is in case you never read Aristotle. It's good to know. Specifically, empathy-based VR to disrupt interpersonal oppression, discrimination, and misperception. So all the things Facebook is selling you, misinformation, discrimination, algorithmic forms of oppression, VR is going to undo that. So as I said, it's interesting that Facebook bought Oculus, right? I think it's part of a strategy to kind of sanitize the things that they're doing, but to also work in a different mode. VR is a way to feel. So this is producing other VRs for VR for Virtue or VR for social change titles, like Nani de la Peña's One Dark Night, which I was going to show to my students, but which was so triggering I just couldn't do it. It uses real-life audio of the shooting of Trayvon Martin and screaming from the street as you sit inside of an apartment and you can listen. You have to listen to it, but you can't go out into the street. Again, the emotional labor of teaching people about race falls on people of color, whether they are alive or dead, whether they are present or not present. And I look also at other titles. This one I think is really interesting because it shows one of the common mistakes that's made about virtual reality and bodies of color, which is that if you depict a body of color in a virtual reality title, that you have then made the person who is experiencing it into a black woman. And I'm very surprised at this because BBC is generally pretty good at not going too crazy around writing about race in digital media, but this time I think they just didn't really understand. So as part of the work that Anna and Sylvia and I have done with Precarity Lab, we interviewed the collective Hyphen Labs, which is all women of color who are working kind of transnationally. They're all designers and architects who do this as a kind of side gig. And all they did was make a virtual reality video where you're getting your hair done in a kind of Afrofuturistic hair salon with other people who are also black women. So you see yourself as in this picture, and your avatar is a black woman. But what's remarked upon here is the idea that there would be a virtual reality experience populated exclusively by black women. This is how kind of racially segregated VR is. It's seen as this big deal. Whereas if you had a virtual reality experience populated exclusively by white men, it would just be called virtual reality. Like it wouldn't be in the paper. It wouldn't be a special thing. And it leaps directly to the idea that seeing is being. That seeing yourself or your avatar as a black woman functionally makes you into a black woman. So I'm going to end with an Audre Lorde quote. I feel like we need to do this every now and again. We already had the master's tool, so I'm going to end with this one. To speak to the question of resistance, virtual reality proposes individualized solutions to the problem of empathy and race. Right? That everybody feels it for themselves, but they also all feel the same thing. You trust the body, you don't trust information. Audre Lorde said that we really can't trust privatized or individual solutions to problems as systemic or wholesale as race and racism and misogyny. So she says, can any one of us here continue to believe that efforts to reclaim the future can be private or individual? So the rhetoric around virtual reality, for those of us who've been around for a while, it's always on the horizon. It's always going to happen next year or this year. But I think it actually is happening this year and is coinciding with this massive backlash against an industry which can't regulate itself. So seeing VR as the new space of dysregulation, where you can film people's houses and not ask them. You can put kids of color in VR on titles about refugees and never get permission. You can show people crying, you can show their bedrooms, you can show their pets, and never have to have any accountability for that, right? Just as we're going back towards accountability in other kinds of things, like our own social media, VR represents, on the one hand, the perpetual or perennial offer to reclaim the future, while at the same time making it a very privatized and individual kind of future where any kinds of ideas about race can be solved on an individual basis and not on a collective one. Thank you. It's a nice introduction. This is like an airplane. It's very close to the
I don't want to be in the middle.
Thank you, everyone. That was amazing, truly. Took a lot of notes and kind of confounded as to how I'm going to pull a couple of threads of questions. But since we were kind of short on time of about 10 minutes, I just wanted to see if anyone had a question they want to ask right off the bat. If not, I'll get into it. Okay, cool. So Anna, I was really struck with kind of what you said about making peace with our compromised position and kind of finding peace within that, kind of finding the ability to cope with that. And also, Lisa, I'm thinking about how you've talked about the way women of color often kind of bear the burden of the intellectual labor or emotional labor of teaching people about racism. So I kind of questioned who is the potential imbalance between kind of learning from this compromised position, learning from this group of people who tend to have lived in a sort of compromised position in the world, and how there might be this potential imbalance in kind of making peace or learning how to do that. And I don't know if that's something you've thought about as you.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's the right question. I think that's, yeah. We're on now. Whoa, sorry. Everybody awake? I think that's the right question. And I think it begins with the word resistance. Resistance is not radical, right? Michelle Alexander has a piece in the New York Times where she's talking about turning away from resistance, right? And particularly black feminisms turn away from resistance. We need structural change. We don't need small changes. We don't need to make peace with a compromised position, right? So for me, in thinking through resistance, it's from a perspective of somebody with a good amount of privilege that would be able to occupy the position of the resistor, or to even embrace something like a politics of resistance or a tactics of resistance. And this is some new thinking, part of, I think, a new project, but I've been finishing a book on parasitism that is very engaged in this question of who can have a certain kind of relative privilege that can be leveraged politically for a kind of potentially a redistributive kind of effect, potentially not. But that project is quite engaged with this question of the kind of racial, gender privilege of certain kinds of subjects that have access to power and therefore are able to participate in a kind of complicit politics where others are not so much. I don't think anyone is shut out from that, but I think terms like complicity, compromise, this is not something that is desirable for many people, right? Given the kind of history of racism and gender and these other things. So.
I was so impressed by the many examples of false choice that you showed, and how interpolated I have become into them, because I've seen all of those at one time but never really noticed and didn't think about it, right? So I just clicked on it because I had to get to my next thing. But as you were talking, I was thinking about something we used to say in the 90s when reading about New Historicism, which is that there is resistance but never for us. Right? So this idea that resistance is not something to give up, but it's something which you can aspire to have, and probably, it may not be for you, but it could be for other people, for people coming after you or people peripheral to you, but that to do it for yourself is already kind of a doomed enterprise. So I think when Audre Lorde was saying it's going to have to be a collective enterprise, it's because, there have to be new forms of community that are going to make that possible. And I think when we're always clicking, we're very alone. Like, it's hard to make a community of resistors to this particular way of interpolating you, because you're always by yourself when you're doing it. So, it's a big question. How can we have kind of communities of resistance to this particular dynamic, which is always interpolating resistance and saying, oh, you want to, hack our site or tell us we suck? Well, we can take that and sell that too. Right?
I mean, I think you're saying it all. I think, the Audre Lorde quote, the master's tools, I think the issue is precisely this feeling of not being able to collectivize, but to be continually, in ways we've talked about during this conference, interpolated as an individual that can only act as an individual and can't even act as an individual, and thinking about what are the conditions under which that is produced. But I mean, also at the same time, looking for models, like collective models of organizing, and seeing also the ways in which they are there. But maybe in the case of, in my talk, in the case of like, Black Lives Matter protests or in the Egyptian revolution, like these things did happen, and they produced all kinds of effects and all kinds of possibilities that can't be dismissed, because in the next moment, they're no longer, fully, the revolution wasn't successful. So I think it's the making peace with is maybe the making peace with the kind of the temporality of that struggle, right?
No, I was just going to say, because I was thinking when you were talking about pathos, Lisa, and you mentioned Aristotle, and I was thinking about all of the ways that all the Silicon Valley people are trying to use ethics is through this Nicomachean worldview, which is very discrete and is very much in the idealized form where you can actually program subject A, subject B. I don't know if you, Nicomachean ethics, the last chapter is this beautiful chapter about friendship, but it assumes that both of the friends are of equal footing. So there's never an ability to have an inequity, there's never ability to have actually different experiences. They all have to be, in this case, in Silicon Valley, living in the mission, going to taquerias, and working at Google. Like, that is the perfect friendship in Aristotle 2.0. But it is to say that it presumes this inability to think about structure because the structure is already there, which is why I was thinking, I want to put you on the spot, Dia, but the idea of that messiness, for me, was so telling, because it is the productive space by which we see these new collectivities emerge.
Yeah, absolutely. And
You have to flip it on the front.
Okay. And I just wanted to say that this idea of messiness is partly something that I was thinking about, but the vocabulary for it's louder. Okay. But the vocabulary for that is not entirely mine, and it was part of when I was talking to someone from Kinky Collective, which is this BDSM group in India that does activism around exploring one's kinks, and I was talking about how we were talking about how online spaces could be places for people to embrace different kinds of kinks and sexualities. And she kind of stopped me and she said, and I have this quote here, which she said that we need to find ways to talk about desire that are closer to what we feel like, which is something that was talked about in the first day of this, yesterday, basically. But she stopped me and said, our articulation needs to be in sync with reality. When you're using words like nuance, it's almost like you're doing something that is airy-fairy, this airy-fairy stuff, and we should stop doing it. Stop trying to repress what it is. And I think that's really important, because even in the kind of languages we use to talk about resistance, I think there's this tendency to slip into this airy-fairy language of all of the possibilities that it can can provide without really embracing of how difficult, how mundane that is at the same time.
Before I ask another one, nope, you're stretching. My bad. Go ahead.
Again, on resistance, there's kind of like a common take now that even in spite of our political climate, that like liberals are winning the culture war because corporations are adopting more socially liberal policies and basically nudging society. And I didn't know if you thought that was a case of corporations co-opting sort of the political resistance, or that is a success story of like a quasi-subject revolution or whatever.
I don't know if this is going to answer that, but I do think that there's something happening. I took that to be for me. That's a question for me. Good. That's a good start. I think that there's something happening, and maybe this connects to Lisa's point about students and racism, where we're seeing things being framed in dangerous ways as debate or as controversy that depoliticizes and completely neutralizes it, right? That's what I was saying about feedback, right? Where the content, the political content of the thing is completely emptied out, and the temporality of what that does is it keeps things always in play. It keeps things never figured out, and they never land. And I think that, you know, this kind of like endless relativistic, like, what is racism? What is it to you? What is it to me? You know, and there's never any like political ground, right? There's never any consequences. So I think corporations are, you know, doing that, and maybe some of the same ways that John was highlighting. I haven't fully kind of wrapped my head around this, but there's definitely a kind of disalignment or a kind of break that's happened between intention and effect, right? Between what race is to us, like scholars of race, right? And what it is to the algorithm, what foreignness is to, you know, what it's being interpreted as. And I think that's one kind of problematic. And I think that that's related to some of the ways I was talking about, you know, the appropriation of terms like disobedience, or the appropriation of terms like Sylvia was talking yesterday about the appropriation of disruption that we're all very familiar with, right? So I think it's like the vocabulary's been appropriated, and there's a total disalignment between political, what might be potentially formulated as political intentions and actions, and the effects that they have, because these things have been broken in some way.
Go ahead, Sylvia.
I have a question that might tie Dia's sort of really interesting comments about the coordination of the creating of the nation to Lisa's analysis of virtual reality. Maybe it ties the other one, the nation as well. But I'm really struck by, you know, how VR seems to be not only the recuperation of Facebook, but also American promise of modern progress. The promise that Facebook would continue that. You know, in that very moment where modernity had seemingly failed, you know, the social media companies came in and were like, well, we're going to keep with that optimistic, future-oriented utopian, you know, promise, I guess, right? So I wonder, VR vis-a-vis India, and maybe, I mean, you mentioned China a couple of times as the larking producer, you know, that shapes some of these conversations. So I'm interested in maybe to hear from both of you and also the rest, you know, what role nationalism, the nation, plays in these processes. What is being recuperated? What is being, so in this approach, this privatization of resistance, you know, what else is at stake that's perhaps on other scales than just the technical creation?
Wow, that's really well put. I think that this question about the nation and what kind of technological nation the US and India and China are, like, that's huge and super interesting questions. So I think in the US, the idea that we would do the right thing because it feels right. It's not that you're following orders or following the law, but rather you follow your heart. I mean, every sappy movie about US identity is about following your heart. I mean, Star Trek is about that, right? You do the right thing, not because you have to, but because in some ways you want to. That's the American way. And so I think what VR is so appealing is that it makes you want to do the right thing because you have the feeling is intense, you cry, you feel compassion, you're like, okay, I'm going to give money to save these trees, I'm going to donate some money to refugees, but that's not quite the same thing as doing it because it is the right thing. It's doing it because it feels right. So this may be a kind of temporary modality to kind of get people over the hump around the tech crisis, but I do feel like there is now a role for people who study race and gender. I'm just not sure whether it's that transformative in Silicon Valley. But I do think they want to hear more about ethics and empathy for sure, and they're making some of those discourses on their own while also trying to appropriate ours. So I did see a Black Lives Matter sign in the Facebook HQ. Like, okay, let's make it a say like, yeah, it's happening.
Yeah, and when thinking about what you were saying, I was thinking about how these producers in the dating app space that are trying to produce Indian dating apps, both heterosexual and homosexual, are themselves very global citizens. So they fly between the US and India and the UK on a day-to-day basis. The head of Tinder India is Indian-born, but has graduated from a leading institution in India, IIT, and then went to the Harvard Business School. The founder of Delta, the app that I talked to, just graduated from Brown. He's got a lot of family in India, but he graduated from Brown and kind of brings these kind of cultural values in. So for me, I think while thinking about nation, it's interesting to think about how these global citizens and global spaces of production are part of building the idea of nation, and that's one thing. And then the second is that in some ways, nation is being replaced by region and regional alliances. So South Asia becomes the way in which people are talking about apps that are Indian, but when they're imagining what this India is, it's the Indian subcontinent. And so people talk about how we are different from the US, but people in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, this is the perfect app for them because they are like us. So in some ways, nation state is being replaced by these regional alliances as well.
Ask one more question. So this is kind of for Justin and John. I was really interested in the idea of kind of probability and the measurement, algorithms as a measurement of subjectivity, and then also kind of utilizing algorithmic accidents. And I think, John, you also write about the idea of an algorithmic identity or an algorithmic truth. I was wondering, I don't want to give too much credence to the idea that we're in a post-truth era or anything like that, but how do you think about these ideas of these multiple truths or these multiple kind of identities and how resistance might play a role in kind of reconciling these different digital and physical selves? And
yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And one of the things I sort of realized as I was trying to sort of write this paper for this talk was I think there's actually, you know, there's sort of this, I think, horrible story, right, that's been told about kind of like how postmodernism and a few French philosophers that maybe only a few of us have read are responsible for all of the political problems and post-truth things. And I think you can actually tell that story much more convincingly by tracing sort of the shift from frequentism to Bayesian statistics, that it's sort of this move from, you know, this sort of, you set up this experiment and then you find out this kind of this certain truth that's applicable across situations to this much more sort of individualized production of truth and subjectivity. So, you know, I don't think that like one is better or worse than the other. I think they just sort of change the kind of the political landscape and the types of resistances. And I think I'm with Anna that I really don't know what resistance looks like in this sort of new world. But I think it's you know, important to sort of think about the ways in which it does sort of create these new kind of, you know, I guess like you were suggesting, Lisa, these kind of privatized and individualized subjectivities where all these systems are constantly modulating and presenting sort of new individualized truths rather than something that can be collectivized, for better or worse.
Yeah, well, for me, it's telling. I think that when Mark Zuckerberg was trying to justify the newsfeed, this is in the, I think the quotation is like, you know, somebody dying in a country across the world is probably going to be less relevant to you than a squirrel in your friend's yard. And I think that perspective of what is relevant is kind of the guiding model of what is Facebook and the algorithms therein. But it's also very interesting because for me, a lot of the ideas talking about identity, what is relevant for identity for a marketer or for somebody who's targeting you is not the kind of the structures of oppression that make really identities political. It's what are the behavioral patterns that make an ethnicity one that you can have an affinity towards if you're white. So example, I like Argentine soccer, and so Facebook literally thinks I'm Hispanic. I'm Danish, I'm not. But what is the persuasive thing? Well, Danish or Hispanic for Facebook is Argentine soccer shirts. And so it's that evacuation that Trent's talking about, this evacuation that also you were gesturing towards. It's like this relationship to truth. It's like it's a truth, but it's a truth that doesn't have the political valence of, I'm also thinking about, in the 60s we had a Combahee River Collective, and then literally like a year after we had these people who were doing marketing at Harvard who's like, if we only focus on men, we're missing out on this extraordinary swath of people. So what if we did they didn't call it intersectionality, what if we marketed towards intersecting categories? And so they were also divining what intersectionality was, but from the entirely opposite procedure, doing it from a profitability model instead of a structures of oppression model. And so I think that way we see truth is very much what is that truth being used for?
Wrap it up. Please thank the panelists.